Your new book is an extremely important book that I actually wish every single American and also non-American would read. Its title is The Technocratic Dark State. And I was thinking when I was reading it that you really don't need that word dark, or it's really needed to make it sound more ominous, but only for those who don't know what technocracy actually is. So this book, it's about a bunch of insanely wealthy and very powerful people who don't like our current system of government. And they have good reason not to like it because it's utterly corrupt, it doesn't work, and it has morphed into some sort of pretense play, playing representative democracy without really being one. So this bunch of people, and it's people like Peter Thiel, Alex Karp, Elon Musk, I think are actually quite right with their critique. However, their solution to the problems is so absurdly bad and it's so insanely inhumane that it's easy to dismiss and not really believe in any of this until you read in Ian's book about their plans in excruciating detail, really kind of painful detail. And it's sourced from their own writings or it's sourced from official documents that really anybody can access. So it's not only planned, sadly, maybe not most, but much of that has already been implemented or is in various stages of development or implementation. And some of that is nearing its final stage. So if you want to help stop them in their tracks, good idea to read his books. This book in particular. They seem to despise people so much that they don't even bother much about hiding what their plans are, what they think about them, and what they plan to do. And simply put, their idea is to do away with government altogether, privatize government, And it means that they want to split it up into these smaller components and run those as private companies by some sort of CEO, dictator CEO with an iron fist. And citizens will be done away with as well. That there won't be any citizens anymore. We'll be turned into customers, but actually not all of us. There'll be fewer customers than citizens because to be a customer, you got to pay. And you got to pay quite a bit, not just a little bit. So a lot of people won't be able to afford it. And well, then good riddance. Welcome, Ian.
Thank you very much for inviting me, Cornelia. It's nice to be here.
So you call people like Peter Thiel, Alex Karp, Marc Andreessen, Zuckerberg, Altman, lots of others. You call them neo-nerds in capital letters. And that's a word you coined, an expression you coined. What are neo-nerds?
Thanks for the introduction of the book. Yeah, that's a very good summary of it. Yeah, they are this group of Silicon Valley based or originating in Silicon Valley oligarchs and venture capitalists that invest in what they would call startup technologies or disruptive technologies. And they are obsessed with, so if we take the word nerd, which we can take from the actual dictionary, it's got various different meanings, but it essentially means somebody that's hyper-focused or very interested in subjects that other people are perhaps not quite so interested in, but in this case, technology and computing. And there's also an urban definition of nerd that suggests that it's people that are heavy metal obsessed gaming fans. And then we take the word neo, for obviously Latin for new, meaning that they have got some kind of new idea or like to present the notion that they've got a new idea. Put it in all caps to, using United States code to express that this is something we should pay attention to, and call them neo-nerds, rather than the self-aggrandizing titles that they like to give themselves, such as Techno King or CEO Dictator or Tech Bros is a term that we hear a lot in the media. And all of these terms, they tend to suggest that these people have some sort of right or some sort of authority to exert control over us. Obviously, the term techno kings, which they often talk about this notion of a king dictator of a sovereign corporation, which is what they envisage running what they would call neo states or network states. And these are basically private privately owned city-states, and they're currently, many of them, flourishing around the world, being constructed, and I cite a lot of examples of those in the book. And yeah, so neo-nerds, I think, I mean, one thing that I did mention in the book is this is not to attack, because I don't like the idea of attacking people for being people, but I think it's important to address their ideas and to put them in the proper context, because their ideas, as you outlined, are quite horrific. They are, they consider AI to be their philosopher's stone, and they are using AI to create a surveillance state, a surveillance structure, which doesn't serve humanity any kind of benefit at all, really. And I think it's important that we don't allow those ideas to flourish by thinking of them in terms of, being some sort of technological great leap forward. They're not. And, I think that, we can use our own language to describe the people that promote those ideas. And I don't think we have to use their self-aggrandizing language.
Right. So, you cover a lot of ground in your book. And if we had 10 hours or so, we could go through everything, but we don't. So that's why I would actually like to concentrate on the last chapters in your book. And maybe these are the chapters that many people don't reach. And that would be a real pity, because I think these are among the most interesting chapters. A lot of the other stuff is better known, I believe, than the very technical and, financial jargon and all this stuff that you cover in the last 4 chapters. It's fascinating, though. It's absolutely fascinating, and it's very important that people understand it. So that's why I would like to concentrate on these last chapters. And you talk about the digital currencies, stablecoins, the tokenization of everything, the synthetic hegemon. I had never heard that expression before, by the way. Mark Carney, the Canadian Prime Minister, talked about it. The synthetic hegemonic currency. So let's get into that. But before we do that, I want to ask you some clarifying questions about these neo-nerds and what they are all about. Give me a little bit more of an idea where they come from. How, for example, how are they different from libertarians, and have they evolved from libertarians?
No, I would say not. If we take a good window to answer that through, or a good person to use as an example, is Peter Thiel for that. Because Peter Thiel is a philosophy major. He has a good grasp of philosophical concepts. And he has self-styled himself as a libertarian. And he would say that, if we go to something like he did with Patrick Friedman, like the Seasteading Institute, the idea is to build libertarian floating citadels. This is the idea of no government, smaller governance, minarchism or anarchism, no government at all. They very much promote themselves at that, but there is nothing libertarian about Peter Thiel's personal ideology as he's explained it. For a start, he has written books and has extolled the virtue of monopolies. So if you look at that there is no space for monopolies in libertarian thinking, because even those that might consider themselves to be on the socialist side of the libertarian spectrum wouldn't welcome huge capitalist monopolies. People that are on the perhaps the anarcho-capitalist side of libertarianism certainly wouldn't. The notion of a truly free market, which I would argue and do in the book, doesn't actually exist. But if it did exist, it wouldn't welcome monopolies. And as Peter Thiel well knows, through his companies like Palantir, which has established a sizable monopoly, I would say, over surveillance technology in the United States. It's achieved that monopoly through partnership with the state, which again is not a libertarian. These are not libertarian principles. So one very important aspect of the book, and one of the reasons that I spend so much time trying to deconstruct their language, is that that they're selling us a lie, basically. That being a great example, because they're not, nothing they do is libertarian. And if we take it at its roots, it's humanist libertarianism. It's about the value of individual sovereignty and individual liberty. So it's very much focused on, or with the view of improving people's lives or providing environments to enable humans to flourish. And if we look at what this group of venture capitalists and technology kind of investors are trying to do, it couldn't be more inhuman. They are trying to control humanity primarily through the use of surveillance technology, which extends to financial technology. Some people might call it fintech. So they are trying to control humanity, and you have to say, at times, if you take the ideas that are promoted by some of their pet philosophers, people like Nick Land, who wrote The Dark Enlightenment, and Curtis Yarvin, who has very much informed this movement that they are part of, the neo-reactionary movement, it is out and out hostile towards humanity in terms of treating us like, one of Yarvin's kind of infamous quotes, or it's become infamous, is waxing us like bee larvae inside a cell, so that as what he calls a humane form of genocide. Now, at the same time, that one of the ways that Yarvin wrote, and Land less so, but certainly Yarvin, is a tremendous amount of kind of metaphor to try and elucidate some of his ideas. But and he was speaking metaphorically in that instance. But obviously, the concept of genocide not being necessarily unwanted, because Yarvin was talking about what humanity could do with what he called the wards. And the wards were the people that serve no purpose. So what could we do with them? How do we get rid of them, basically? And he sort of jokingly and pithily suggested first that they might be boiled down and made into glue. But then he went on to say, no, we could just wax them up in these cells and entertain them with virtual reality. So they would have a kind of brain death, but that'd be the best thing to do with them, these people.
Yeah.
So
No, he doesn't.
They're not affable to the idea of human fulfillment, or they're not at all humanitarians. So that's the antithesis of liberty. That there couldn't be less libertarian.
Yeah, and he doesn't. In this where he talks about the humane version of a genocide, he doesn't explain, I think, sufficiently at all why people would go through the trouble of waxing people up into these cells and entertaining them with music, because of course they wouldn't do that. It doesn't make any sense. These are useless eaters. They are a burden, and they will be done away with. We shouldn't have any illusions about it.
No, and also, Nick Landers spoken about the fact that our sovereignty, so our individuality, is worthy only of derision. So we are literally meaningless in this. I hesitate to call it philosophy, because to me, philosophy explores the human condition, and there isn't any of that in this. It's not. I don't think it's philosophy. I think it's just some sort of crazed ideology. It's so. It doesn't have any philosophical merit, I would say. People might choose to call it objective, isn't it? People might choose to call it philosophy. Certainly, these neo-reactionary people like Thiel and Sam Altman and people like that would call it that. But and certainly Marc Andreessen would. But it isn't, in my view. And I think one of one of the reasons, also going back to what we were talking about earlier about why I used the name, or chose to sort of give them the moniker neo-nerd, is because they are already implementing, although Yarvin might have been talking about genocide metaphorically, their companies are already deeply involved in real genocide. So Palantir, undoubtedly it's got this relationship with the Israeli military industrial complex, and has been involved with the targeting of children in Gaza. So, that even though their pet or house philosophers might use metaphor, these guys, and they are predominantly men, these guys are not acting metaphorically. They are putting these ideas into practice.
Now, you just mentioned the term neo-reactionary, and that is that actually a term they use for themselves? So they call themselves neo-reactionary?
Some do. So people like Ghislaine Verdon do. People like Thiel, Altman, they don't say that they are neo-reactionaries. However, the nearest thing we get to it is Marc Andreessen saying, I am, or we are, he uses the collective term, we are accelerationists. So who is we? So we is definitely the people that have been backing the Trump administration, that are part of this body of people that are investors in startup disruptive technology, or startup companies that specialize in disruptive technology. And he is part of that group. And he openly says, we are accelerationists. And he cites Nick Land, the author of The Dark Enlightenment, which is the foundational kind of body of work, if you like, or treatise that underpins the neo-reactionary movement, as a patron saint of what he calls his techno-optimist manifesto. So that is an open admission that he certainly, and he presumably feels able to call himself part of a body called we, are supporters of the Dark Enlightenment, the ideas of the Dark Enlightenment. Now, what is, I would say, is more evident, if that's an obvious admission of that fact, but what is more evident is that if you understand the processes that are suggested by the Dark Enlightenment, a lot of that revolves around this notion of accelerationism, and the notion of private fiefdoms, the construction of private neo-states. That is happening. If you look at something like Pronomos Capital or Niue Capital, which certainly Peter Thiel and Altman and people like that are involved with, they are undertaking that process. So they are, whether or not Thiel openly says I'm a neo-reactionary, he is implementing all the strategies that are favoured by those that call themselves neo-reactionaries, and he is closely associated with that network. He's got a known close relationship with Curtis Yarvin. Famously, they spent the 2016 elections drinking beer together like mates, watching the election results in the US. Yeah, they're neo-reactionaries, all right.
So you mentioned the Dark Enlightenment and Nick Land, who wrote this book about the Dark Enlightenment. And with Dark Enlightenment, they actually refer to Curtis Yarvin and Nick Land. They refer to the Enlightenment that is usually not considered as dark, but as enlightened, as the name says. But they regard it not as such. They contrast this enlightenment that they call dark with something that they call, I don't know, liberated enlightenment or something like that. Give me just a brief overview of where are they coming from? Why do they describe something that for us is the epitome of enlightened thinking as just the opposite? And what do they want? What do they regard as truly enlightened?
Well, I think that a good way to look at that again is through an article or an essay that was written by Peter Thiel, and I've forgotten the name of it. My Straussian moment, I think he calls it, or is it my Straussian moment? Or I can't remember the precise name of the article. But in that, he points out that, or from his perspective, that the Enlightenment itself because it was focused on what we might consider to be kind of libertarian kind of ideas and the exploration of enlightened thinking and the exploration of those kind of ideas, that it failed to take account, in his view and in the neo-reactionaries' view, of the inherent destructive nature of humanity. And because it didn't, in their view, take that into account, it failed to see the problems that were inherent to self-organization along the lines of the sovereign individuals self-organizing to form, what we might call political structures today. So therefore, failed to account for the true nature of which they've predetermined, by the way. They've decided that humans are essentially destructive. Therefore, they need to be dealt with in some way. And that's what the Dark Enlightenment sets out to do. It sets out to solve the problems that arise from democratic principles, which Curtis Yarvin refers to as a disease called demosclerosis. Demosclerosis. And therefore, this needs to be addressed by basically reasserting dictatorships, because dictatorships are the only way that humans can actually be organized in any meaningful sense or any useful sense from their perspective.
Well, that's very interesting what you said, that they criticize the Enlightenment for disregarding the inherently destructive nature of human beings. And well, of course, human beings are inherently destructive, but that's not the only thing they are. They are also inherently constructive. But it seems to me that they are fully embraced with their enlightenment, or whatever they call it. They have fully embraced the destructive side of humanity to get to this enlightened place. And that, just looking back over the 20th century or over human history in general, has always been a complete recipe for disaster.
Yeah, no, they're as I said, and the reason that I've obviously, wrote the book is that their ideas are extremely dangerous. I mean, I one of the problems that I tackle in the book is that we don't really have the appropriate kind of frames of reference in order to kind of describe what they're thinking. They've invented or have created a whole new lexicon that they use amongst themselves to describe their ideas to each other. And we're not necessarily part of that. In fact, sometimes we're deliberately excluded, I suggest, in the book. So, we tend to think of things, if we think of kind of the great kind of socio-political schisms that we've got, we tend to think at one end of the far right end of the spectrum, we've got fascism or national socialism. At the other end, we've got communism. So we tend to frame these things in those sort of ideas. And we ask, well, when we're considering a concept like technocracy, we always think, well, is it more fascistic or is it more communist? What is it? And what I try to suggest in the book is that these descriptors that we've got for these kind of systems are outmoded now. We're in a new paradigm, if you like, where we have to rethink our own understanding of what constitutes these kind of traditional left-right divisions that we're familiar with, in order to be able to wrap our heads around what these guys are actually promoting. Because it's neither. I mean, it's, in many respects, it takes the ideas of fascism, which is, if we boil that down to the amalgam between the public and the private state, and fuses that into a new thing that they would call, they would say that this can be done through a process. Again, we're using neo-cameralization, would enable you to create this perfect symbiotic kind of fusion between the public and the private sector, which is like the ultimate extension of the kind of Italian fascistic kind of model. But it's not fascism. It's a technological supremacist ideology, if you like, which is something that they are promoting as, and ironically, going back to what we were saying earlier, that they are promoting as if that was a libertarian idea, simply because it could theoretically, they say, enable you to get rid of government. Sure, you can get rid of government as we understand it, following their model. As we understand it, government wouldn't exist if we went down the path that they are suggesting. But they're not replacing it with any kind of liberty. They are replacing it with the most tyrannical form of dictatorship that anyone could possibly imagine. We haven't even imagined it yet. They're talking about basically techno-feudalism on a global scale. So your whole life being ordered and ordained by AI algorithm. So we saying, we need to, and why I wrote the book, we need to develop a framework that enables us to discuss what they are talking about. Because the problem is, although these ideas that I go through in the book might seem wacky and off the charts crazy, and I agree, I think many of them are, there are people that are in, I would strongly suggest that these people have captured the second Trump administration. They're in control of it. And so that gives them immense power on the global stage. And they've got these crazy ideas. So, or we would consider them crazy.
So I think you said something really important there when you talked about we don't have the framework to understand what they are talking about. So you said, oh, is this Marxist? Is this fascist? What is this? Because what they believe in and what they want really cuts across it all. It just obliterates this divide between Marxism or communism on one side and freedom on the other side, or representative democracy. It just obliterates it completely. And that is I think something that you explained very well in the book. You in one section you write about the importance of not thinking in horizontal categories. So like Marxism here, it's kind of on the same level, right? You have Marxism, you have whatever, Marxism, fascism, some sort of democratic system. And then you have also all sorts of things on a horizontal, and people are fully accustomed to it because we fight about it all the time. We fight on this level all the time. Whereas you say, oh, this is kind of like a distraction to keep us busy and not see what's really happening. You say what's really important is the vertical, what's happening in the vertical. So can you explain that?
Yeah, I mean, Dr. David Hughes, who I know that you've spoken to, is he discussed this as in terms of what he called the omnivore. So our normal kind of the dialectics that we're given nearly all the time, get us to oppose each other. So left versus right, black versus white, gay versus straight, man versus woman, young versus old. We are this. It goes back to the just basic divide and conquer to keep us at each other and competing against each other and at each other's throats often, in order for us to be controlled by those that are overseeing the whole system, which I would argue is oligarchy, and it's always been oligarchy. It's been oligarchy for thousands of years. So there are people that do have the power and the influence to control governments, I strongly suggest. And we're seeing that actually happen in real time at the moment in the US with this group of Silicon Valley oligarchs, none of whom were elected, who all have tremendous power and influence. If we take Elon Musk, for example, literally put into office, Marc Andreessen the same, choosing appointments for political office within the government of the United States. Well, nobody elected any. They weren't elected. They just took the power, and there we got private sector players making public sector decisions, and that is a power that exists above what we would normally be familiar with in terms of kind of the political establishment. So while we are arguing with each other to and fro about whatever issue it might be, the people that are making the decisions are just carrying on doing business. They're just carrying on organizing the world and organizing our lives. And we're not paying any attention to them. We're just simply allowing. I mean, if we look at, for example, what's happened in Gaza, for an example, we think it's about, or it was about, basic Israeli government expansionism, right? So it's true, the Israeli government has got this Greater Israel project in mind. And then we think, that the Palestinian people have therefore got a right to independence, and therefore the Palestinian supporters, the people, that there were large demonstrations all across the world in support of the Palestinians, and then there are some demonstrations elsewhere in support of the Israeli perspective. So you get this to and fro, this people battling against each other. Meanwhile, the investment and the military technology that enabled the actual operation to function is being orchestrated by a global network of venture capitalist investors who are exploiting both sides so that they can put in place, as they are trying to do at the moment in Gaza, their neo-state project. And that is what is, manipulating the situation. I know that there are a lot of complex historical issues there, but nonetheless, these people are having an immense controlling influence over what is happening on the ground, while everybody argues with each other about which side they support. And frankly, it doesn't really matter which side they support, unless they start addressing the influence of the people that are actually controlling matters. And those people, as I suggest in the book, exist above the even the presidential political level.
So this is a nice transition to start talking about all this financial stuff and the role of money, because you said, organizing the world, and the creation of money plays a very important role in organizing the world. And I want to quote something from your book here. You talk about the oligarchs conundrum. Actually, before I quote that, I would like you to clarify the following. You mentioned two very powerful groups in your book: the NEONERDS that you already talked about, but also a group of people that you call like the old established oligarchy, the oligarchs. Who are these oligarchs, and how does that work with with this new group, these newcomers, these parvenus, these neo-nerds? How do they work together? Give me an idea.
Okay, so if you think of the one family that we might cite, it might be the Desmarais family in Canada. I've just been writing about them. So their lineage goes back hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. Goes back all the way back to the Venetian Republic. Their ancestors came from there. They were money lenders. They garnered immense wealth. The family spread around the world, and a famous branch of the Desmarais family settled in Canada. So the Desmarais family holds a big part of Canada Petroleum. I can't remember the name of the company now, but anyway, they oversee a financial empire that is currently investing in Chinese weapons manufacturers. Now they're based in Canada. So they are true. I would say that some people talk about the black nobility sometimes, so being these historical families that going back many, 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 many centuries. So, famous example might be the Rothschilds. And then you've got newer money that's come into that kind of arena. We might talk about the Rockefellers or somebody like that. But people with immense power and influence that have exerted control, I would strongly argue, through their ability to turn the money taps on and off. They control the issuance of money through the central banking system today. That they have this power. They have this power to set policy. I mean, they call it policy coordination. So when you see, it through the think tanks like the Bilderberg Group or the Circle or these kind of groups, which are oligarch-led, governments call this, being able to coordinate policy with investors. So you have to, we've just had the European Union issue its plan for, the energy transition, and expressing how important it was to coordinate the policy with investors. So the question is, who are the investors? Well, if you trace the investors, that you can go normally. There's three major investment houses that are represented on the boards of nearly all corporations, and represent the majority of shareholders, the truly wealthy shareholders: BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard. So their investment is there somewhere in whatever policy coordination governments say that they are engaged with. And obviously these large investment houses hide the names of the individual investors. But I think it's fairly easy to identify families like the Desmarais family are involved, heavily invested with BlackRock. So you can say that this group of people have had this global control for a long time. Obviously we can go all the way back to Plato for the notion and understanding of oligarchy. But throughout history we've always had them, and we've still got them. So some of these people, their wealth is inherited, their wealth is generational. Then you get people like this group of Silicon Valley oligarchs that I've talked about. Now, some of them come from quite wealthy backgrounds as well, families, but some of them are self-made. Elon Musk doesn't come from a particularly wealthy background, for example. He's made billions. Now, part of the way that these people make billions is forming partnerships with those investors. So they form partnerships so they've always been backed by those investors. But nonetheless, they also form partnerships with government, state. But they are relative newcomers. They're new oligarchs, if you like. Now, they're definitely oligarchs because they're private sector actors that are currently have, I would say, certainly a lot of influence, but to the point of outright control over the current US government. So how do they ingratiate themselves into this global network of think tanks and oligarch-led think tanks and policy making institutions like the World Economic Forum? How do they become part of that? And I suggest very much in the book it's because they've got a new idea which benefits all oligarchs equally. And that new idea is the thing that I discuss in the book.
Okay, and great. And before we go there, just a quick word about Epstein. Because Epstein, Jeffrey Epstein, he was not from a wealthy family, of course, and he was able to really gain the attention of very well-established oligarchic families like the Rothschilds. I mean, his relationship with Ariane de Rothschild, for example, it's absolutely remarkable how they ate out of his hand. Epstein, he is not a neo-nerd.
No,
he's definitely not a neo-nerd. How do you put Epstein in there, and what is the role that Epstein played?
I think the reason that everyone talks about Epstein is because he's been exposed. You know, and what he was doing was exposed. But he wasn't alone. And he's not alone. There are many, many Epsteins. You know, Epstein has been exposed because, I suppose in Epstein's case, it was because of his relationships were particularly close to Western, well-known political figures. So obviously with his island and everything, he was running a compromat operation, which fair enough. He was doing that. But Epstein really was a cog in a global network. Now that global network, I mean, if you read, I highly recommend if your readers haven't read it, that they read Whitney Webb's work on Jeffrey Epstein, One Nation Under Blackmail. There's 2 volumes of that. It's well worth reading because that will give you an idea what I'm trying to get at. He kind of was like a linchpin between this kind of relationship that had formed between organized crime, mainly often US crime, but also, the cartels, the intelligence network, the military intelligence establishment, if you want to call it that, which has been operating closely together for many, many years, and global finance, which brings in, oligarchs like Leslie Wexner. So he was kind of embroiled in that network. Now, and he was caught. I think that's more the point. He was caught, and therefore everybody knows about Jeffrey Epstein. But that doesn't. And I would suggest that there are many more figures like Jeffrey Epstein. So in terms of, we've just had, we just had this big scandal, or we're currently having this scandal in the UK about this former US ambassador, Peter Mandelson, who was I mean, everybody's known for 30 odd years that Peter Mandelson was at best corrupt. And he was appointed US ambassador. Why? We then learn that, Peter Mandelson has been working with people like Peter Thiel to get kind of to get his venture capitalism functioning for the purposes that Thiel wants it to work for. And that's how things work at this level. I mean, a good point, going back to what we were talking about earlier, above the level of government, global finance is moving many, many, many different parts about the world. Epstein was involved in that network. So Epstein, sure, the compromat thing was a big part of it, but also, money laundering, arms sales. He's part of the lubricant that is greasing this system. So, I mean, the only thing that I would say about Epstein is because he's been so thoroughly exposed, he's an interesting case study.
Yes, actually, that's a good way to describe it. Part of the lubricant that is greasing the system, and that's the way it has always been in the history of mankind. And Whitney Webb makes that case. Her books are excellent, and she builds up. I mean, this first volume, Jeffrey Epstein plays almost no role in it because she wants to show that this is kind of normal, and here are all the other people and all the other networks where that allowed him to arise from, and so she puts it into context instead of saying, "Oh yeah, this is something absolutely extraordinary, has never happened before." No. She says, "No, it's just the opposite. It's actually." Unfortunately, the way power works and power systems work, and you have to be aware of it. You have to look out, because if you're not even aware of it, then how can you understand it, and how can you stand in its way and try to make sure that it doesn't work quite as well oiled as they would like it to work. So, okay, so let's finally go to what you call in your book the oligarchs' conundrum. And I want to quote this sentence here. So you say, you're right. Dynastic oligarchs have possessed sovereign authority and control over the international monetary and financial system, IMFS, for centuries. And then you say neonerds. So in contrast, neonerds are limited by their lack of access to the money-making spigot. Yet, for the neonerds to impose their network of Gov Corp technates on the entire globe, they need their more senior oligarch partners to share the sovereign authority to print money. This is a big ask. And it is. It's a huge ask.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the issuance of a currency, it's funny actually, because I've just had a debate about this. As someone who's done a critique of my book, the issuance of currency is central to enabling a network state too. Because what we're talking about, they want to create these city-state fiefdoms that are controlled by a CEO. They would call it a CEO king, ruled by a sovereign corporation, as you alluded to as you explained at the very beginning of this discussion. So that's what they're trying to create: private city-states, a bit like the old kind of, if you imagine kind of the feudal states of during the kind of Middle Ages in Europe. That's what they want to build, but a modern technological version of that. So in order to be able to do that, to set up the unified ledger, which would be probably a blockchain, so distributed ledger technology of some sort, where all the assets of everybody that lives there, and as you said, they don't call us citizens, we'd be customers of the network state, that all your assets, all your transactions, and all your, rights, your licenses, your permits, everything that you do on a day-to-day basis has to be represented on the ledger. So in order for that to work, they must have their own currency, because every transaction has to be controlled via the ledger, and that would be through the issuance of currency. Now, the problem they've got with that is that as I explore in the book, the issuance of currency, so what are we talking about? Currency. So a currency is a medium of exchange. So the dollar, the yen, the whatever, right? Now, a lot of people would say that is not money, because money also incorporates the inclusion of financial assets such as treasuries or bonds or whatever. That builds what we might call money. That's liquid money. So that's not quite the same thing. So they want to issue their currency, but that currency has to function as money in order for them to be able to manage all the different transactions on their unified ledger in their network city-state. Now, currently, central banks are the only people that can do this. Well, central banks control the system that enables them to do this. Actually, most money is created by commercial banks. But leaving that aside, the overall system is controlled through central banking. So they're asking if they can be basically non-bank issuers of currency. Now, that is in the current monetary system, that's not allowed. You can't do that. You can use the money that is issued by commercial banks to transact, but non-bank entities can't create new money, quote unquote money. And that's what they're asking for, so that they can do that, so that they can run their network states. And that, as I said, is a big ask, because up to this point, only that tiny select minority that have got ultimate private sector shareholder control of central banks have had access to that ability, but they're asking for it. And you have to say, when you look at things like the Genius Act in the US, they've been given that tool.
Yeah, exactly. And we are going to go to that. So you mentioned that it's actually the commercial banks that create a lot of that money. So private banks, private entities. And in the in the United States, we have the Federal Reserve System, which is a very strange thing, very strange creature. because it's this hybrid. You know, you have the Federal Reserve, but the Federal Reserve consists of these regional banks that are commercial banks. They are not like part of the government or something. No, they are private banks. And you point out in your book that in other countries, the central banks are actually completely independent of the branches of the government, totally independent. Whereas in the United States, it's a little bit different. They are under congressional oversight, and that actually makes a big difference in the way that these neo-nerds can get their hands on currency creation. And I don't know how. I think that a lot of people, maybe you can talk about why this is so important, that it's actually commercial banks creating it, that the central banks are independent from the government. Because I think this is a topic that a lot of people know very little about. And at the same time, unfortunately, it's really important to understand what is going on there. And because if you don't understand the basics, it's very hard to understand what is happening with these stable coins. And what is happening with this Genius Act and with the sovereign wealth and the tokenization of everything, because it kind of builds on a basic understanding of the system that we live in.
Yeah, I mean, I introduced that section in the book by saying, you know, for a lot of people, their eyes just glaze over when you start talking about money creation and, you know, the international financial system, and people just go, "Oh God, how boring can it be?" And I think that there's a reason for that. Sorry.
But you know, yes, I saw. No, sorry to interrupt you, but I just have to interrupt you because when I read that sentence, I read the sentence, thought, okay, fine, fair enough. And then I started reading these chapters, and I thought they were absolutely fascinating.
Oh, well, that's good. That's pleasing to hear, because
I was surprised myself. I thought they were actually the most fascinating chapters.
Oh, that's
not
great.
Dry. My eyes certainly didn't glaze over, and I think that will be true for a lot of other people as well. Because what you are describing is so horrific and so terrible, and it's understandable. I mean, you make it understandable, so it's not like calculus or something. It's actually not that hard to understand if you put your mind to it.
Yeah, I'm glad. Well, I'm very pleased by that, because that was the idea, because I know it's a difficult subject to broach with people. Certainly when I talk to my friends and family about it, it doesn't go down very well. But basically, money is created by commercial banks when they lend. And this is a very important, most of it, 97% of it, without getting into the weeds of reserves and so forth, most money is created by commercial banks when they lend. So the example to take is, if you go to a bank for a loan and borrow 1,000 euros, so you go to the bank and you sign a loan agreement. So you sign this piece of paper, a loan agreement, and in exchange for that loan agreement, which is a contract, so in exchange for that contract, an agreement that you've made to repay the bank whatever the bank has agreed to loan you, plus interest, the bank deposits however much you borrow, let's say 1,000 euros, the bank deposits 1,000 euros in your bank account. Or you think it's your bank account, it's actually the bank's bank account, but you've got access to it. I don't want to go there. I've complicated it already. So you think that money existed in a vault somewhere. So somewhere the bank has got a vault of money that it's taken the 1,000 euros out of and put the 1,000 euros into your deposit account. That is not how it works. That 1,000 euros didn't exist. It did not exist until you agreed to take to borrow it. At the moment that you borrowed it, the money is created. So the money hitherto didn't exist. Now, if you think of that from a balance sheet perspective, you've got a liability of the bank, which is the 1,000 euros that they promised to pay you, which they've just put in your deposit account. But they've also got an asset that counterbalances that. So the asset is the agreement. So you've just given them a signed contract, which is worth 1,000 euros plus interest. So the difference is the interest, and the interest is the profit that the bank makes. But if you look at it from a balance sheet, those things seem to balance out. So you've got a liability of €1,000 and you've got an asset of €1,000, and the only difference is the interest, which is the bank's profit. However, that assumes that the bank is therefore measuring that liability, that asset is recording that asset on its reserve account with its central bank. So that's an asset for the commercial bank with the central bank. But it isn't, because the central bank does exactly the same thing, but with a different type of money called reserves, but does exactly the same thing as the commercial bank. The money didn't exist until the central bank created it by loaning it. So that liability of the commercial bank is an asset, is a liability of the central bank. So this the same process repeated. Now we call that the split two-tier system financial monetary system. But the net effect of that is that commercial banks are creating money in the. So if we think of the real economy, the economy that you and I live in, where we buy and sell goods and we trade and we do that kind of thing, we are using a medium of exchange, a currency, in order to value products and services, or to put a price on products and services. That money is owed as a debt to someone. So who owes this liability? It is a liability of the banks. It is a debt. So who is owed the debt? So ultimately, the commercial banks owe the debt to the central banks. But who do the central banks have still got this new liability that they've created? Money itself is called a liability of a central bank. So who is the liability to? Someone has to be the beneficiary of that liability at some point along the line. And the beneficiaries are the people that back the central banks, and the people that back the central banks who get that incremental amount of interest when that liability, when you follow the path through with that liability, you get that incremental amount of interest, which is money created for nothing because there was no lending in the first place. The lending didn't happen. It's not like they've taken something and then lent it to you and then you give it back to them. They've just created lending from nothing. When the whole system works its way through and they get the interest payment back, that interest payment is money earned from literally nothing. It is nothing. So if you think of that, you think of the billions, trillions probably of transactions that happen every day, where money is being exchanged, where money is being created, and then when it's lent out, it's created. When it's returned, it's destroyed. The difference is lending rates, and the difference is, the money that is earned on the movement of liabilities. That money is getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger all the time, and that money is owed to ultimately the beneficiaries of those loans. And who are they? Well, that's the oligarchy. That is the global oligarchy. They run things like central banks through private ownership. So ultimately, what this boils down to is us being subservient debt slaves, if you like, because we're not the beneficiaries of that. If we have a mortgage, for example, we have to go to work to produce something of value in order to be able to earn the money to pay back the mortgage. So we have to work, we have to do real work and produce real things, goods and services that have real value in a real economy. We have to do that. But the people that are in control of the money spigot, as I call it in the book, don't have to do anything. They could just sit back and allow the system that they've created essentially to farm us like we are, we're debt slaves on a plantation, effectively. We don't experience it like that because we get all the the benefits of living in a modern society. But ultimately, every penny that we earn that we think is ours is a debt that we owe back to the people that are controlling the international monetary and financial system. And it's so important that we grasp that because ultimately, that's the that when we spoke earlier about the left-right divide and who's controlling whom, it is the people that have the power to create or destroy money who control pretty much, I would argue, and I've long argued this, everything. Because if you think about the ability to control the flow of capital around the world, which they can, that is a power that is beyond governments, beyond nation states, even beyond, unions of nation states. That is an immense power, and they've long had it. And the NEONERDS, these Silicon Valley oligarchs, are asking to be let in on that, a little slice of that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, there's a great book with the title "The Lords of Easy Money" that forgot the name of the Leonard or something. I'm not sure. It's a journalist who wrote the book that explains this really well. What you just talked about, this lending from nothing, and I would say, I mean, the amazing thing is that it has been working so well not so well in the last decades, but it has been around for like very, very, very long time. And I think there is some justification for it, but not to the extreme that we are experiencing it. I mean, you have, I think a lot of people know that banks do not have all that the money that they are loaning is not really there. So this is why there are bank runs, right? And people are aware of that. If everybody wanted to withdraw their deposits at the bank would have to shut down because they don't have that money. But there has to be, I think there has to be a limit. There has to be you have to say, well, maybe they can lend twice or three times as much or whatever as they have, but not 7 or 8 times or whatever it is.
I mean, I think there are, if lending was what people often think lending is. So if I did lend you, if I had, say, $1,000 worth of gold, and I lent you that gold so that you could use it for whatever you wanted to use it for, on the understanding that you would pay me back $1,100 worth of gold back, then sure, that's a service that I'm providing. So that's a valuable service because I'm perhaps enabling you to expand your business, but I'm taking on a risk. So therefore, it's not unreasonable for me to ask you to pay me to take on that risk. Now, if banking worked like that, which it could, if banking worked like that, then sure, and equally, I'm not saying that banking doesn't provide an invaluable service. It does, but they're not lending you anything. This is the point. So there is no risk really from the banker's perspective. And I think, if you can go back to the Rialto Bridge in Venice when they first started coming up with the idea of fractional reserve banking. Now, a lot of people will say that fractional reserve banking is legitimate, even though, there's this whole concept of the money multiplier that, you as long as you retain a fractional reserve of 10%, the other 90% you can lend out and get back with interest. Sure, I suppose that people will say that that's a reasonable model, I guess, and some people do argue that fractional reserve banking is a sensible model of banking. But at the same time, they're still multiplying the amount of risk that they are willing to say that they are taking on by 900% in that example. So they're not actually 900% or 9 times the amount of risk that they are actually taking on is what they say they're taking on. So I would suggest that isn't reasonable either, because it's still, creating money out of nothing, in my view. So there are forms of banking where, and often, say, for example, Islam banking, Muslim banking, supposedly does do exactly what we just said. It lends out what it's got, its reserves, it lends it out and it gets it back. So it's supposed to have this kind of risk model built into it. It doesn't work like that, because obviously, like a lot of Islamic states do lend out a lot of money, but nonetheless, the concept of banking isn't necessarily bad, but the way it has operated for the last at least 1,000 years is not good for any of us.
Yeah, and the banks, of course, they make money with the interest. So they never want you to default on your loan, because then you don't pay any interest anymore, right? Because when you look at all these bailouts and all these bailing out countries, bailing out banks, the goal is always to roll over these loans somehow, so that the interest payments continue, that they never stop, because that is when somebody defaults on the loan, and this loan is no longer an asset for a bank, but already all of a sudden it's a liability. It's their liability, so they want to avoid that at all costs. And this is a basic concept that a lot of people do not understand, and it's the basis of the entire system, the financial system in the United States.
Well,
I mean, things would
everywhere, in fact, yeah.
Everywhere, yeah. Yeah, right. Not just in the United States, of course, right. So, okay. So now let's go from here to all these new things that have been happening and that many people do not understand. So first of all, a lot of people know about and are afraid of the CBDC, so the central bank digital currencies. So give me an idea of the role of these CBDCs and why in the United States CBDCs are more difficult to implement than in other countries. And then also talk about the executive order by Trump about CBDCs and stablecoins.
Yeah, so as you said earlier, outside of the US, mainly, pretty much everywhere, central banks are truly independent of the political establishment or the political state. So, for example, I use the example of the European Central Bank. The European Central Bank, in its Articles of Constitution, says that it will not, under any circumstances, take any direction or instruction or even advice from any government. So it controls monetary policy for the whole of the European Union. So that means that it sets the lending rate, and it sets it which gives it a tremendous amount of economic influence. It controls the flow of capital within the European Union. So that's pretty important. But it's completely independent of the European Union. It's totally independent. And then when you look at who is backing the European Central Bank, again, if you follow it down, it goes down through regional banks, then that goes down to, commercial banks, and then who are the shareholders of the commercial banks? Well, that's the same people that we're talking about. The oligarch class, the major shareholders, the beneficial shareholders of these big corporations, financial institutions. In the US, the situation is somewhat different, and that's why the Fed is structured as it is. As you said, it's not a centralized bank. It's not a central bank in the way that European and other banks, and Russia and China and India have got central banks. It's a Federal Reserve system. and it is split up into these regional banks. Probably the most powerful among them is the New York Fed, but nonetheless, it's got all these different regional. And now each of those is structured as I've just talked about, in terms of the structure of the European Central Bank. You follow the money down, and it's the private commercial banks that sit on the boards of things like the New York Fed. So they ultimately, through that mechanism, is how major shareholders of private corporations, private banks, control the Fed in this case. But the problem that they've got is the issuance of currency in the US, or the issuance of money in the US, is theoretically overseen by Congress, which means the people. So it's a constitutional right in the United States that the people and only the people oversee what they call the power, quote unquote, it says this in the Constitution, to coin money. So the power to coin money is overseen by the people. Now the idea of a central bank digital currency is that it will give these private institutions total control of a new digital international monetary and financial system. That's CBDC is programmable money that slots into that system. That's why they want it. That's not going to work in the US, because even though Congress is the dog which is wagged by the tail in this of the Fed. The Fed tells Congress what to do, not the other way round. But theoretically, it could be the other way round. And theoretically, the people could assert their control over the Fed if they only knew about it, which not many people do. But they could do it, right? It's in the US Constitution. Now that's a problem if you're going to embark on a global transformation of the entire international monetary and financial system, when your leading reserve currency is the US dollar. So that's, that could all go wrong very badly. So what are you going to do about it? You need some sort of workaround. How are you going to do? Which for the, I for many years, well, since central bank digital currency has been something that I've been looking at, I couldn't figure out why the US wasn't more enthusiastic about central bank digital currency, because it's the type of thing that the US administrations are usually right up. They're really gung-ho about that kind of centralized control of everything. That's right up their alley. So why don't they like it? And then it was the work of John Titus who pointed out this problem that they've got in the US with the Constitution that made me look at that and think, right. And then I started investigating that further, and he's right about that. That is a problem. But then they obviously need some sort of workaround. How are they going to have? Because the main point of central bank digital currency, from the surveillance and control aspect, is that we will all need digital identity in order to access our digital wallets, which will contain the currency. And the currency and the wallets and our digital identities will all be programmable. So conditions can be set on everything that we do. Every transaction we make will be subject to a condition through some sort of smart contract, probably, which will control it, right? So, if you say the wrong thing, or, you write the wrong thing online, you could be punished by algorithm by controlling your access to money. So that's
exactly. And with AI, you can fine tune that down to the individual level, down to the personal level where it hurts you most. I mean, because they will know so much about you that they know exactly which strings to pull.
Yeah.
In order to get compliance from from someone. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so the key to that is the programmability of central bank digital currency. But obviously, that's may not work. There's a good chance that won't work in the United States, which has got the US dollar reserve as an important currency. So what are you going to do? So stable coins and things like deposit tokens or tokenized deposits are variations of programmable digital currency, but rather than being issued by a central bank, they're issued by a commercial bank. So, or in the case of stable coins, a non-bank a non-bank institution like Tether. So it's not a bank, but you can use stable coins for exactly the same. They slot into the system of programmability just as easily, if not more so, than a central bank digital currency. So you can attach smart contracts to any kind of digital transaction using digital currency, programmable digital currency. And stable coins do exactly the same thing, serve the same purpose as central bank digital currency, or the other version, the commercial bank version, is deposit tokens. Any of those will do. Now, in the US, they've gone down the stable coin route. So they can issue the stable coins, which will be backed by US treasuries, just like the dollar or just like any kind of dollar instrument, will be one-to-one convertible for the US dollar. So the stable coins are effectively the US dollar in digital form. But instead of calling it a central bank digital currency, they call it it would have to be issued by the Fed. They call it a stable coin, which is issued by a company like Tether or, someone like that. So it's the same system, but using a workaround, and that workaround came with the Genius Act, which was that came from an executive order that Trump made when he first came to office, because the Americans, quite rightly, when they were electing their president, were concerned about central bank digital currency. I mean, anyone that understands what it is should be terrified of it. So they didn't want it, and Trump promised that they wouldn't have it. Probably, I don't know whether he knew, but certainly the gaggle of technocrats that were around him knew that they weren't going down that path anyway. There was no chance of the US introducing it because of these problems we've just outlined. So they knew that already. So it was an easy promise for him to make. So he comes and with an executive order saying, there will never be a central bank digital currency in the US, to much fanfare, and then adds in the same executive order, we are going to set up a regulatory framework for the establishment of stable coins, which ends up being the Genius Act. And the Genius Act treats stable coins as what they call a non-bank entity issued, not a national currency. The key phrase in the Genius Act is that they are not a national currency. So because they're not deemed to be national currency, they're exempt from a lot of the oversight that would be normally, for example, like the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Federal Reserve are excluded to a certain degree for the oversight of their issuance. But they serve in every single other respect. They serve exactly the same function as the US dollar.
Can I just?
Sorry,
Ian, I just want to stop you here to go a little bit more into this, because this is really crucial. So these stable coins, they are issued by non-bank entities. So they're not issued by the Federal Reserve, which means they are not caught in this conundrum of congressional oversight. They're not, because the Federal Reserve does not issue stable coins for this, correct?
Yes. And they're called, it's a key phrase that's in the Genius Act, is they are not a national currency. That is repeated about 4 or 5 times. They are not a national currency.
So why not? How is it justified that they are not regarded as a national currency? Because, I mean, what's the reason? I don't understand the logic.
Good question, because they act as a national currency. So they are going to be exchangeable, in the high street, or the Americans would call it Main Street. You will be able to buy goods and services with them in a commercial setting anywhere.
Right.
They are backed one-to-one. The idea is that they are backed one-to-one by the dollar. So they are, in every single conceivable regard that you can think of, as from our perspective, people that are being enticed to use them, a digital version of the dollar. They are backed by treasuries. They're backed by liquid. They have to, the custodians for say the US for tethers, custodians, for example, for USDT, they have to hold liquid reserves of dollars and other dollar instruments like treasuries to cover the issuance of their stable coins. So they are the dollar in every, but they, just by simply saying, and this is why I criticize the Genius Act so much in the book, by just saying that they're not a currency, not a national currency, when in fact they obviously are, they do this workaround. They sidestep the Constitution, and now the stable coins can slot into the new global international monetary and financial system. The dollar can seamlessly, in effect, integrate into it without there ever being any possibility that Congress could interfere, or the people, more to the point, the people or the Constitution of the United States can interfere with that process, because it can't, because they're quote unquote not a national currency.
Yes. So in other words, they are a national currency. Let's just say they are a national currency. And the reason that they say they are not a national currency is simply so that they don't underlie the same restrictions that a national currency would, because then you get probably into all sorts of legal problems with the Federal Reserve, because they wouldn't be able to issue non-bank entities wouldn't be allowed to issue a national currency that, et cetera, et cetera. So they're just lying about the stable coin. I mean, really, in effect, it's just a blatant lie so that they can do what they want to do.
Yeah. I mean, it's quite remarkable, actually. I mean, I try and stress this as well in the book. This is the private issuance of. So the problem that we've got with this is as I explain in the book, the current monetary system is a private sector operation. Money has always been issued by the private sector, but we don't think it is. We think it's issued by governments. But in reality, it's always been a private sector operation. But nonetheless, as far as most of us are concerned, governments issue currency. They issue our national currency. So for the first time, really, since Bretton Woods at the end of the Second World War, private non-bank institutions have been given the power to issue currency. That is huge.
It's like a revolution, right? I
Well,
mean, it's absolutely revolutionary.
That is. I mean, I had an argument with someone the other day that was saying, well, they're not actually issuing currency because they still have to back it with dollar reserves, and that's true. They do have to back. So really, it's still the Fed that is issuing the currency. They're just fronting it. That is, and he made a very good point. But the point is that doesn't change the way that money has always been created. Money has always been created through this mechanism that we've just been discussing, and it's always been fronted by the private sector, although we think it's the public sector. Now, if, say, for example, Tether, we'll stick with the example, say Tether want to increase the availability of its stablecoin USDT. Say it wants to increase the volume in circulation. How does it do that? It does that in the same way that money is created currently. Fiat currency is created. The dollar is created. It has to increase its reserve assets. So how does it do that? Well, the same way that the dollar is created. They go to to buy more reserve assets effectively. So this is a sea change in the way that monetary systems work, because instead of hitherto only commercial banks could do that. Only commercial banks could increase or request more reserves in order to expand lending or whatever. now a non-bank, privately owned non-bank entity can do the same thing, and that is a sea change.
So who are these privileged non-bank entities that have the authority to do this? I mean, I'm sure it's not it's not the 7-Eleven down the street as a non-bank entity. So how do you get this enormous privilege?
Well, I mean, so you're looking at the advent of, so the custodians for Tether, for example, their reserve assets is Cantor Fitzgerald. So Cantor Fitzgerald, that's linked to people like Howard Lutnick, who's a member of this group. In order to get liquidity into this system, Peter Thiel, Sam Altman, Marc Andreessen have just set up a thing in the United States called Erebor Bank, which is going to be the bank that's going to create the liquidity. So it's pretty clear how the system will work. If Tether wants to increase circulate or increase their volume for USDT, say, and they need more liquidity in order to ramp up their reserves with custodians like Cantor Fitzgerald, they'll go to a bank like Erebor. Erebor, controlled by these same people, will issue the, whether or not it will consider it's a wise thing to do. They will decide whether or not to expand the monetary supply. But the monetary supply, which would be an outlet basically for US debt, will be decided by this group of people, not the people that were traditionally, holding the purse strings or holding or controlling the monetary policy of the Fed. I'll rephrase that. They will still be doing that. But now we've got this new group who are specialists in digital money creation, who are been invited into that Ponzi scheme. So that's the thing that has changed.
Wow, that sounds pretty awful, and I don't see how it's not going to lead to inflation. How is it not going to lead to some sort of hyperinflation eventually?
Well, I mean, it's the same. I mean, how does incessant monetary expansion not lead to hyperinflation continually? It ultimately it does. That's why we have boom and bust cycles. That is ultimately where it ends up for us. For us, we end up either enriched or impoverished by it. But the people that are behind the system are always enriched by it. it's never ending for them. Bust cycles work just as well, as boom cycles. So we are controlled by that, and we always have been. Our economies are controlled by it. Having a new player in the system isn't necessarily going to massively expand the monetary supply, but it does enable it to expand over time. And the current model of the monetary system is a constant expansionist model. So one of the things that one of the problems that the international monetary and financial system has got is that it is reaching this point of absurdity. I mean, it's preposterous on its face. We have a global debt that is orders of magnitude greater than all the productive, product and money, available money on Earth. It's 10, 12, 13, 14 times the debt than the whole global economy, which obviously is a nonsensical. I mean, it just can't. It's physically not possible, let alone logically possible. So something's wrong, and that thing that is wrong is the debt that we owe to these oligarchs. But if they can tokenize everything, they can create a massive new asset class or classes. So they can turn trees into tokenized assets. So those are assets that didn't exist before. Now they're talking about potentially a global tokenized asset economy of maybe You know, they're often very optimistic about these things, but $4 to $5 quadrillion. So that is 10 times the size of the kind of GDP of the planet as it currently stands. If you take all GDP and all assets into consideration, broadly, that's about 500 trillion annually. So this is massive, much bigger than that. So what that means is they can continue the monetary expansion. So new players can come into it because the advent of things like stable coins coming into the money creation game won't necessarily spike, expansionist monetary policy. Really, they're just taking a slice of it. They're being invited into it and they're taking a slice of it. But the tokenization of everything will create new markets, which will enable the expansion. If you think of it from, again, going back to the balance sheet idea, if your debt, your liability is 500 trillion and your assets are only 100 trillion, then you're in trouble. But if you can make your assets worth 4 quadrillion by saying that a tree is worth this much, and just claim a whole new pile of assets, then suddenly your $500 trillion debt is small, it's tiny.
It's tiny. Yeah, no, that's a really nice situation to be in, right?
Yeah.
So you just talked about the enormous global debt and how absolutely huge it is. And I was just thinking, these global organizations like the WEF and the United Nations, of course, they incessantly talk about sustainability. They never talk about the sustainability of a situation like that with the debt. But they don't talk about it, but I'm sure they are very aware of it and that it will collapse at some point. It cannot go on like this forever. And the this whole tokenization idea is something I think pretty radically new. At least I had never heard about it before. A couple of years before I heard about it a couple of years ago, which is an exceedingly ominous and strange solution and dishonest solution to this problem, but it would take care of this sustainability problem with these enormous debts all over the place. And well, let's go there, because the stable coin, as you said, so the stable coins, fine, that's like that's like a drop in the bucket. It's not going really to save the system or keep the system from collapsing. But this idea of tokenization, of natural asset tokenization, that is a complete game changer and something that many people don't really know about and it is so preposterous when you first hear about it. I remember just thinking, this is so crazy. Do they really mean this? And they do really mean it.
Yeah.
So let's talk about this. What is this wealth fund called? The sovereign wealth fund.
Yeah, Trump's sovereign wealth fund. Yeah.
Yes, Trump's sovereign wealth fund.
So going back to that analogy of debts, a balance sheet with liabilities and assets, and the problem, a lot of liabilities, not many assets. So you need more assets you either reduce your liabilities massively, reduce the debt, or you increase your assets. So the solution that they're going for is increasing assets. I mean, it's all flim-flam, really, because, it doesn't really matter whether you reduce liabilities or increase assets. It doesn't really make much difference. It's the same net effect is the same thing. You can carry on doing what you're doing. That's what it's really about. But with tokenization, so what is tokenization? Tokenization is, if you think of let's take a house, for example. A house is worth, let's say it's worth 500,000 euros. So that this house is one thing, it's one entity, and that's what it's worth, 500,000 euros. You can split that into 500,000 €1 chunks. financially, which we already do, that's €1 or whatever. But you can split that into 5,000 chunks. But you then put those chunks as a token on a blockchain. So the token represents 1/500,000th of the value of that property. So if you own all of them, you own the property. If you own half of them, you only own half the property. But of course, whoever owns the house owns the property, right? So if it's my house that you just tokenize, the fact that you own half the tokens doesn't mean that you own half my house. But that's not what tokenization is supposed to do. It's half the value of the property. So, obviously when it comes down to contract law and all that kind of thing, then the tokens would actually represent the value of the house. But it's the concept here that we're trying to get to. So that's the idea of tokenization, splitting things up into digital tokens that represent the value of something. So that's fairly easy to understand if it's a house, because a house or a bar of gold, because a gold bar does have intrinsic value. It is worth something. But that's not what they want to tokenize. They want to tokenize nature. So, and everything else. So oil, coal, gas, all of the stuff that we normally trade every day, all commodities, all food, all everything, all of that would be represented as tokens on a digital blockchain. So trading will be conducted in the digital international monetary and financial system by exchanging tokens for products and services. So if you're a trader selling wheat, for example, you will trade using the tokenized representation of wheat stocks. That will be how commodities are traded. Now, that has to represent something that's actually happening in the physical world. So many tons of wheat have to actually be moved from a seller to a buyer. But the tokenization happens purely digitally, and the exchange of the information, if you like, or the exchange of the value of that product gets done digitally. Again, that makes reasonable sense when we're talking about things that already exist. For example, commodities that already have value, and that, okay, we can understand this is merely a new kind of ledger system for doing the transactions, right? The difference is that, like central bank digital currency or like stable coins, with tokenization, you can program the transactions. So now you can set conditions on the sale of wheat, for example. So who sets the conditions? Well, now that means that the people that have controlled access to the permissioned ledger set the conditions on the tokenized sale. So now you're introducing control globally into business to business transactions, people buying and selling commodities. They will have conditions imposed upon them, written into them we're told, by AI. And this will all be much better and seamless and make things much easier. But of course, who programs AI? That's the question. And who sets the conditions? Well, that will be the central banks. That will be the Bank for International Settlements. That will be these major financial institutions will now have this ability to control all transactions, literally control them by programming them. But that's, as I said, at the moment, we're only dealing with things that currently exist. So we're talking about instituting digital control over all transactions for things that already exist. But what they want to do to create this new asset value is tokenize everything. So they want to tokenize nature. So, for example, a field has got a field of grass. It might have a land property value, which you could tokenize, but also it's got a productive value. How much is that field worth if you graze cattle on it for the next 10 years? How much is it worth then? Oh, well, we can give that a value. So we'll give that a value and we'll tokenize that. So now we're projecting value and tokenizing that. What about things like trees? If we combine that with sustainable development, trees represent what they call an ecosystem service. So like any service, what does a tree do? Well, a tree, it sucks in CO2 and pumps out oxygen. So that's a service. How much is that service worth? Well, let's value it and tokenize it. That's what they intend to do. What do mountains do? Mountains, produce water. Air condenses over mountains and waterfalls. So that's worth something. How much are those mountains worth? How much is the service that those mountains produce worth? Oh, well, that's worth billions. Right, okay, well, we'll tokenize that. So we'll tokenize everything on Earth, including humans. How much is a human worth? Well, they produce so much a year, so they're worth this. Right, well, we'll tokenize their workflow and we'll do that. All of that gets combined into tradable assets. So you can buy a group of tokens or trade tokens for whatever it represents, like you can currently, but with all these new asset classes, and trade them on a new global international digital international monetary and financial system. And that I would say is the game. That is what they're at. That is the game for all the marbles, because what that is the creation of a new, hitherto never existed before, global economy, the basis for a new global economy, which not only will it be much, much greater in terms of volume of what can be bought and sold, for those that have access to the permissioned rights to the ledgers upon which all this financial activity will take place, it just gives them total control of everything. Total control of everything. And that will be combined with AI programming every transaction. So every transaction will be subject to conditions controlled by these people, who are the people that we've just been talking about for the last hour or so.
Right. So do you think that once they start tokenizing, let's say air, do you think that you have to pay for every draw of breath? The United States owns a huge amount of land, especially in the western part of the country. Huge amount. So, which means it's really, well, I always thought that means the real owners are the American people, and the United States government or the state is just the steward of the land for the population of the United States or its citizens. So how does that legally work? How can you take the land, so the United States, the land that it owns, it can tokenize that and then sell it to the NEONERDS to build their smart cities? How does that legally work?
I think it will work the other way round. I think they'll sell it first. So Trump has talked about building this sovereign wealth fund. And he in his executive order announcing the sovereign wealth fund, which is he estimates to be worth, I can't remember what he said now, 650 billion, I think, of assets, which would nicely sort out which was the equation that I was talking about earlier, which would nicely sort out part of the deficit that they've got every year. Although already I think the US has got, for the first time in the second Trump administration, has got $1 trillion deficit in the first quarter. So that's not going to get any better now, is it, with a war? So yeah. But the point is that they think that they can free up this land, which is quote unquote government owned. But as you quite rightly say, government land means the people's land, or it should do. That's what we are told to believe government is supposed to be all about. It represents the people. So it doesn't. And one of the points that I try to make in the book is that governments don't have any possessions. Governments don't own anything. Governments don't borrow money. Governments don't lend. It's the people. We're on the hook for all of it. Everything that the government calls an asset is actually a public asset. Everything that it borrows is actually public borrowing. And everything that it owns is actually public expenditure. It's ours, or it should be. But governments don't act like that, of course. And certainly in trying to build his multi-trillion-dollar sovereign wealth fund, Trump is just saying that they can sell land. Now, it's debatable whether they can or not. I know that there have been challenges in Congress to try and put a hold on that when they've tried to do that before. When they first tried to launch these natural asset companies, there were challenges to that, forbidding the sale of government land to do what they're trying to do now. However, with the sovereign wealth fund idea, that idea is still on the table. So that idea of selling off public land. So if let's say Peter Thiel bought half of Yellowstone Park, what could he do with it? What use is it to him? Now, traditionally, when people make money out of land, they make land either because the land itself speculates in value, or they do something with it, like use it for agriculture or use it for construction or whatever. In the new model that they're creating, just owning something like Yellowstone Park without doing anything to it, which is very similar to the way that the monetary system works in terms of those that have the power to lend, it in itself, just by existing, becomes a service that you can sell and tokenize and sell. So the actual land itself becomes something that you can monetize without doing anything with it. You don't need to put any additional investment in it. You can just buy it and let it sit there and make money out of it because it's tokenized. And they're already doing this, by the way, in the Amazon rainforest.
Well, with the carbon credits, right? I mean, that's a huge market
credits.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, they're already doing this in the Amazon rainforest. People are buying up sections of the Amazon. They're not logging it. They're not, buying it so that they can extract the timber. They're buying it just so that they can sell the oxygen that it produces and the carbon sequestration that it enables, because obviously it takes in CO2. So this is already happening. So with Trump's sovereign wealth fund, the attraction for private investors, and you can see how this would work actually, because let's take Yellowstone for a start, for an example. Obviously, there would be resistance if a private investor came along and said, we want to buy 2,000 square acres of Yellowstone. And people go, no, you can't do that. That's a public resource. But they could just say, well, we commit or sign a contract where we absolutely guarantee that we won't do anything to it. We won't build on it. We won't construct on it. We won't do anything. We'll allow unfettered public access, just as it currently is, but we just want to invest in it to protect the environment. People will go along with that. Well, okay, if you're going to protect it and that's enshrined in the contract, then fine. If you want to buy it, buy it. But of course, once they bought it, it's a long-term investment in nature, because they can then tokenize it and sell it. And that's how tokenization is intended to work. It is creating value that never existed before. It's the creation of new value, which can then be bundled up and traded on the financial markets.
Right. But the whole thing is it's like a deception, because nothing has really changed. The debt, the spending, it's all the fundamental problems. Nothing has changed.
No, but then I would argue that yes, that is true. And yeah, it's if you like, it's a fake fix for a fake problem. Because there's when we think about how you and I transact in the real world, right? If you make something, you make a nice ornament or a cup or something, you've worked on that, your labor has created it, you set a price for it, I buy it, I've got a cup. Everyone is happy. That's how commerce should work. It's only when we introduce the layer of third-party intermediaries, banks, and then we introduce speculative financial markets and money markets, that's when the whole thing starts getting crazy. That enables Ponzi schemes to exist. There's no reason why we need to follow that monetary model. It's crazy. It's a crazy monetary model. So the whole problem that exists of the debt is itself fake. It's a fake problem. It could, we could scrap the debt tomorrow if that didn't mean that very, 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 very wealthy people would no longer be so wealthy. So that's not going to happen. So they have to come up with a fake answer to a fake problem. And that problem is, is the spiral in debt, and the answer is the tokenization of everything. But along with that, having manufactured the problem and now having manufactured the solution, is that once again, what that means is they get more control, more centralized power and authority over everything else. Because that's always the solution.
Yes, that's correct. And it's not even, to me, it's not clear what the consequences of that would actually be. I mean, I can see the consequences that you just pointed out, but when this tokenization, if that tokenization should really take place in that way, but how that will change, it's hard to imagine. It's such an unusual and strange idea that I find it very hard to imagine what this would actually lead to eventually. It's completely clear that it can be used to control every single one of us, and it will create even much more powerful and probably even eventually smaller elites of unfathomable wealth. But what they are going to do, or how that is going to impact humanity, not in a good way, as far as I can tell, because once you have this tokenization scheme in place and you sell, let's say, land or whole areas to NEONERDS that then decide that they are going to be in some sort of extrajudicial area where they can do whatever they want, they could actually start building these tech nates that they're talking about.
Yeah, I mean that's a slightly different thing. Yeah, I mean they certainly can. They're already doing that throughout the world with special economic zones. So special economic
Yes.
zones are deregulated zones which governments establish usually to attract foreign investment. So a classic example would be the free port. So a free port is a zone, an economic zone where, for example, at one end of the scale, you've just got subsidized warehousing costs and maybe some sort of limited relief on import and export duty. So it encourages businesses to set up business there, and encourages imports and exports. It encourages cross-national, cross-border trade. So you can understand why governments would have these these regulatory incentives for business to set up business in, for example, a free port. But at the other end of the scale, you've got the totally deregulated, autonomous charter city, which, for example, in an example that I use is in Nigeria is the Lekki Free Zone. So the Lekki Free Zone, they're already building pronymous capital backed by Thiel and Andreessen and Altman and people like that, are building or have invested in the construction of a city called Etana, or a nascent city-state in the Lekki Free Zone called Etana. Now, one of the things that an MIT, I think, professor of African study, and I forget the guy's name, I can't remember the guy's name, said was that when you enter the Lekki Free Zone, you are leaving the state of Nigeria. So the Lekki Free Zone has been created as this deregulated, autonomous zone within Nigeria. Physically, geographically, it's in Nigeria, but it's not part of Nigeria, even though it is supposedly subject to the oversight of Nigerian government and Nigerian law. It's independent within Nigeria. Now, there are zones like that all over the world. There are more than 5,000 of them already. And as I said, they're on a spectrum. At one end, you've got just simple free ports, and at the other end, you've got nascent charter cities. Now, one new zone that is obviously emerging is Gaza. That is exactly what Gaza. Now, I mentioned Gaza once, I think, in the book briefly, so I didn't want to start going down the whole, talking about Zionism and so forth. I thought that was too much. It was slightly off topic, but I did mention it in the book. But I finished writing the book in the summer of 2025, and it is with a regrettable degree of Schadenfreude that the thing that I was talking about that they are doing, lo and behold, they've gone and done it and are trying to do exactly that in Gaza. Gaza, the new Gazan proposed miracle city, which has been modelled on this idea that it's copying ideas from places like United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia and places like that. These Middle Eastern miracle cities like Neom.
Like Neom?
Yeah,
Neom, right. Mm-hmm.
So Neom's interesting because Neom, the city, is a bit of a white elephant. The whole thing they were building, the line, is way too expensive. It's probably not going to pan out. But the Neom is an economic free zone. Neom is not just the line, the Neom city. It's also this big expanse, this special economic zone. And
a big port. It has a huge port.
Huge ports. And that's all going ahead. And the same is true now, it looks like, in Gaza. So literally, if you think about what Trump wants, or the Trump administration have said, or rather Jared Kushner has said, that they want investment, to attract investment into the new Gaza miracle city. It's $1 billion buy-in, which is exactly what the neo-reactionaries have been talking about. You buy power, you buy sovereignty. That is the Dark Enlightenment. That is what the Dark Enlightenment boils down to. So they are putting it into practice now, in Gaza. So this is why I try to stress in the book. The things that I'm talking about here, although they might seem like wild and wacky concepts, they are being put into practice. They are following that trajectory and actually acting on these ideas, implementing these ideas.
Yes, interesting. And it makes sense to do that. To buy sovereignty is especially easy in places that are war-torn, like Ukraine is another good example. The digital transformation of Ukraine and what is happening there, that is not really known to many people. But Ukraine actually has a ministry for the digital transformation of the country.
Yeah. I mean, in Ukraine, it's actually the Dia app, which is this all-seeing, all-knowing app that they've created that everybody uses or has to use or will use for pretty much everything. So if you think of your banking and your and buying and selling goods, then things like your driving license, your marriage certificates, your birth and death registration, your mortgage, your everything going through this one system, which is represented by one app called the Dia app, which is actually an ecosystem of apps. But nonetheless, from your perspective, it's this one thing that you access that controls everything about your life, pretty much. That is called, the Ukrainian translation for it is the digital state. That's what it's called. It's the digital state. So that, again, exactly what these people are proposing, and again, the same companies involved, the same investors involved, doing that in Ukraine. And Ukraine has been like a kind of model that they used for fine-tuning their AI targeting systems and weapon systems, which they then took to Israel, and Israel bought into, which they then used to commit a genocide in Gaza, which they flattened. I mean, it is so sickening what the US Trump administration is proposing and the Israeli government is proposing in Gaza. It's it's appalling, truly appalling. But they are literally proposing building a quote unquote miracle city on the graveyard of the 20,000 Palestinian children. They flattened it, destroyed humanity that was there, destroyed all the infrastructure, turned it into a big building site, and now moving in to exploit and take that, which is their model. That is the model that we're talking about. And I would say that if you look at what's happening in Lebanon, same. And I think if you look at the wider implications of what's happening with Iran, same. So this thing is being rolled out. It's being rolled out. So we need to know what it is, and we need to understand what these people have got in mind, because it is horrific.
This whole idea of buying sovereignty also leads to this idea of that you write about in your book, that the nation states will actually disappear with their governments, that they will no longer be will be nation states at some point.
Yeah, I think as we head towards the what some people call the multipolar world order, where the world would be split into regional unions, probably. The idea of the network state is that it's funded, self-funding. So the quote unquote founders of the network state do a kind of crowdfunding exercise to fund, infrastructure development and new buildings and purchase land acquisitions and all that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. Which is fine if you're but we're not talking about a collective of farmers that are building a homestead. We're talking about the richest people on earth. So if they start crowdfunding, their homesteading project in your country, pretty soon they're going to gather all the resources and everything to themselves and leave you with not much. So this is we are moving from this, and another thing I'll talk about in the book, we're transitioning from, I would say we've had for many, many years, public-private partnerships, which are, the way that stakeholder capitalism is supposed to operate. What these guys have done is come along and even said to the stakeholder capitalists, so the Klaus Schwabs of this world, or the World Economic Forum crowd, Borge Brendy, people like that, they've come along and said, look, guys, your stakeholder capitalism model, public-private partnership, is great, but it's going to take 40, 50 years to get where we want to go. Let's just do it now. Accelerationism, dark enlightenment. Let's just go. Let's just smash everything to pieces now. And just take it all. And we'll privatize everything. That is essentially what they are arguing for. Short, sharp, shot. It's kind of the blitzkrieg of venture capitalism is what mm-hmm. they're promoting.
Mm-hmm. And it's not what people are understanding, right? They're not. I think many people have no idea, are not aware of what is going on and what they are in the process of implementing, right?
Yeah, no, I don't think so. I mean, even lots of people that are aware of things like technocracy. I mean, I've written the book, hopefully. I mean, obviously, I hope people will get the book, but I've written the book, I hope, not for people that already know what all this, a lot of people, as you said in the first part of the book, a lot of people already know what technocracy is. A lot of people already know what, to be fair, quite a lot of people already know about how the banking system works and all that kind of thing, right? But the book is not written for people that already know. It's written for people that don't know. And I hope it explains a few things that people might take on board. And I guess I'm most pleased about with the book really is I think, and the same thing happened to me when I first started reading the work of people like Patrick Wood. I read his work, and then I suddenly thought, hang on a minute, I can actually see that happening. I can see when people like Anthony C. Sutton and so forth are talking about how banks invest on both sides of wars and create this kind of thing. I thought, well, wait a minute, I can actually see that. That is happening. So what they were talking about and writing about was, I could see, well, that they're probably onto something, because I can actually see that panning out in reality. And I think, unfortunately, if people grasp the things that I've tried to go through in the book, unfortunately, they will see it panning out around them in reality, because it is happening.
Yes, and that's a good thing that they see it around them, because so you write the technocratic dark state is not offered to you, to the reader, as a black pill. So as what are you offering it?
Well, hopefully is motivation for people, because as you quite rightly said, unless you can see what the problem is, what are you going to do about it? People, as you said, don't know that this is happening. They haven't got a clue that this is happening. So they're not going to address it because they don't know it exists. So once they do understand it, and once they realize what these people are doing, then we are in a position to actually start addressing the issue. And that issue is not going to be resolved, in my view, through any kind of political action. That issue is going to be solved by what we do in our own communities and how we respond to these systems that are being pushed at us. They're constantly trying to push us into accepting those systems. And as I try to point out in the book, if we don't, where's my, I can't even got it on me. Like, if we throw away our smartphones, if we choose not to go along with facial recognition, if we choose not to use online banking apps and insist on going in the branch, if we use cash and refuse to use digital currency, if we do that in sufficient numbers, there is nothing they can do about it. Nothing. So other than brute force. But if we then focus on, acting in our local communities to build support networks with each other and around each other, and create some independence from reliance on the state, and create some independence from reliance on multinational corporations, we will be able to resist this simply through, building actually better lives than we've got now. Because one of the things that I noticed well in the book is that what is the advent of all this technology? What has it actually given us? Do we live better lives? Or are we just being, I mean, I don't know about you, but I experience life now as a series of people sitting on their own. A great example is just going to a cafe. Go and sit down in a cafe and just look at what's going on around you. People aren't talking. They're not together. They're sat there in their own little bubbles, scrolling on their fondle slabs, unaware of what's going on around them, not paying attention, I have to say, they don't appear to be enjoying themselves. Their lives seem to be quite insular and boring. It doesn't have to be like that. We don't have to live like that. So all we need to do is consciously make a choice that we're not going to live like that. Because if we do that, everything that their future plans are predicated upon is us adopting and using the technology that they want us to use. If we don't, Not only is there not much they can do about it, their plans will collapse. They won't work. If we don't use these systems, they won't work. If they tokenize a forest and start trading that on international financial markets, sure, that might benefit them, in terms of international financial markets. But if their hope is to then turn that so that they can control every transaction you make because you're using digital currency, but you're not using it, what are they going to do? There's nothing they can do about that how are they going to force people to do things that they don't want to do? Because there's 8 billion of us.
Yes, that's very true. That's very true. And before we end, I just want to say one thing I liked about your book is that you not only say, as you just said, oh, we can throw away our phone, which nobody will do. I don't have much hope into that, or go back to older times. I think that's very, very hard to do. But I think you point. Oh, good for you. Not many people are going to follow in your footsteps, though. I really doubt it.
Yeah.
But you also point out in your book that there are. The question is, how do you use technology? And you don't have to use it in a way that ends up enslaving you and controlling you and surveilling you and making your life absolute hell. You talk about, for example, permissionless blockchain. You talk about distributed, which is distributed ledger technology, but that is permissionless, that could be used. And there are other ways where you can imagine a smartphone that doesn't sell your private data, that has protections where you are actually in control of your data and not somebody else. So there are all sorts of solutions that should be discussed and should be thought about, which is currently not really the case.
I mean, there are people that are obviously working towards, one of the issues that came up recently, I don't know whether you're aware, but there's the system D component of the Linux operating system. Somebody put some age verification requirements in it. So trying to make it a standard. This was to comply with some US state legislation, not federal, but some US state legislation. They just updated the system D system of Linux so that it would ask for age verification. Now, that immediately, as soon as somebody did that, it was forked. Like, as in people said, well, we're not having that. So they created copies of that, because it's an essential part of the Linux operating system. They created copies of it that didn't contain that. And that's the kind of thing that we can do. And when people say that or question technology or the use of technology in the way that I do, and lots of other people that kind of agree with me do, the automatic response is that you're some sort of Luddite, that you don't want to use technology or you're opposed to it. And one of the points, again, that I stress in the book is it's not technology itself that is bad. It is the way that these people intend to use it. They intend to use it for the total subjugation and control of humanity. The same technology could be repurposed to emancipate humanity. So, it's not that you're some sort of, one of the things that people say is about, returning to a more kind of agrarian lifestyle. Well, that's fine if you live in the countryside, but what if you live in the middle of a big city? You can't suddenly start farming goats, right? Right. So it's got to be a solution that works for everybody.
Yes. This Luddite argument, I don't think that flies anymore. I have observed, and you, I'm sure too, and also the polls are showing this very strongly, how much people dislike AI and how afraid people are of AI. So there's not this. They do not share the excitement and optimism of these NEONERDS. Obviously not, because they see it as an enormous threat.
But they've all got things like Alexa and Siri and all that kind
of. Maybe that's going to change.
Let's hope so.
Because as you say in your book, and I'm quote the sentence in your book, in order to resist the maniacs, we first have to understand the real nature of the war they are waging against us all. And something like Alexa, I used to have Google Assistant. I got rid of it years ago because at first I was completely naive and thought, oh, this is cool. I'm going to try it out. And I don't want to have anything like that anymore.
I remember
or anything.
chatting to some people. I was saying about, because I was pointing out that Alexa is constantly listening to everything they say. I said, no, it isn't.
Yep.
I said, how do you know?
Yep.
I said, well, because when it only listens when I say Alexa. I said, well, how does it know you said Alexa?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Well, yes, yeah. It deletes everything else, right?
Oh, yeah, it deletes everything else.
It deletes everything else. Okay, including ourselves at some point. Thank you very much, Iain.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's been good.